Constructing a castle was far more complex than assembling a basic wooden shelf. There was no room for error, and a single miscalculation didn't just result in an unstable structure, but potentially tons of stone collapsing onto someone. Kings often learn this lesson harshly, typically moments after someone confidently proclaimed, "That should hold." Medieval kings were essentially the first property gurus, and their concerns went beyond just good school districts. When it came to castle construction, selecting the right location was akin to a high-stakes game of Monopoly. A wrong choice could lead to losing more than just finances. Kings couldn't simply point at a map and declare, "Build my castle there." They needed a location that guaranteed safety, reliable supplies, and strategic power. It's comparable to selecting a seat in a classroom. You want a vantage point to see everything, easy access to the exit, and perhaps proximity to borrow a pen when needed. However, instead of pens, the concern was safeguarding against armies intent on invasion. High ground was the medieval equivalent of premium penthouse living. Medieval kings weren't solely focused on hydration, although that was indeed important. Rivers and lakes functioned as natural moats, complicating enemy assaults. They also provided fresh water for drinking, cooking, and cleanliness, as no one desires to reside in a castle reeking of unwashed socks. Recent archaeological investigations have revealed that certain castles possessed sophisticated water management systems, including subterranean cisterns capable of storing sufficient water for hundreds of individuals for siege durations of months. Proximity to major roads and trade routes was akin to having a castle adjacent to a medieval highway. Consistent supply deliveries were essential. Food, weaponry, building materials, and all necessities for castle upkeep. This mirrors how modern cities develop around key transportation arteries. But instead of Amazon deliveries, you receive cartloads of grain and iron. Occasionally, the ideal castle location was already inhabited. Imagine informing an entire village. "Apologies, but the king desires this hill for his new castle. Time to pack up and relocate." It's like a sibling claiming the best spot on the sofa, but on a vastly larger scale. Historical records indicate that some medieval kings relocated entire communities of up to 1,000 people solely to build their castles. A truly extreme version of eminent domain. And incredibly, they sometimes even moved entire churches. Imagine explaining that to the Pope. "Yes, Your Holiness, we are merely repositioning your church. No cause for concern." The process of securing the perfect location involved more than just physical attributes. Kings had to navigate a complex interplay of politics, property rights, and feudal obligations. It was like playing chess, Risk, and Sim City simultaneously. A single misstep could ignite a war or incite a peasant uprising. Indeed, there are documented instances of castle construction projects being halted midway due to political disagreements. Medieval construction project failures. Sometimes kings would attempt to sweeten the deal for displaced locals. They might offer alternative land, tax exemptions, or other benefits. This is similar to parents buying ice cream after making you tidy your room, except the room is your entire village. And the ice cream, well, probably still not quite sufficient compensation. One particularly astute king in the 12th century offered lifetime positions within his castle staff to the leaders of a relocated village. Talk about a medieval career change. Truly clever kings would also choose locations with symbolic significance. Constructing a castle on the site of an ancient battlefield or holy ground was like medieval public relations, conveying messages of power and legitimacy. It's akin to modern politicians favoring speeches at historic landmarks, but with more dungeons and drawbridges. Some castles were even erected on sites linked to local legends or myths, adding an extra layer of supernatural intimidation to their already imposing presence. Defensive considerations could become remarkably inventive. Some kings opted for locations that initially appeared unfavorable, but possessed hidden advantages, such as building near a swamp. While it might have smelled unpleasant, try maneuvering siege equipment through marshland. A renowned castle in Wales was constructed with 3 sides facing sheer cliffs, making it virtually impregnable from those directions. A prime example of working smarter, not harder. Certain castle locations were even selected based on astronomical alignments. Some medieval builders positioned castles to allow sunlight to stream directly through specific windows on significant dates, like the king's birthday or religious holidays. Medieval opulence at its finest. Of course, once the perfect location was finally chosen, only the initial piece of the puzzle was solved. Next came the truly enjoyable part, gathering all the materials needed to build this massive stone fortress. And by enjoyable, I mean a logistical nightmare that would make contemporary construction projects seem like child's play with Legos. Just imagine attempting to move thousands of tons of stone without trucks, cranes, or even proper roads. In fact, the stone required for a typical castle's foundation alone could fill approximately 50 modern swimming pools, and that was just the beginning of the material acquisition saga. You might assume it was as simple as ordering from medieval Amazon Prime, but alas, no such luck. We're discussing moving thousands of tons of stone without trucks, cranes, or even decent roadways. It truly makes one appreciate modern construction equipment, doesn't it? Let's consider some numbers briefly. A typical medium-sized castle required about 12,000 tons of stone. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the weight of 2,000 elephants. The largest castles could utilize up to 50,000 tons, essentially a small mountain's worth of rock. And you thought moving your sofa was challenging. Recent archaeological studies of larger castles in Wales have indicated the use of stone blocks weighing up to 1.5 tons each, heavier than a modern car. The nearest quarry wasn't always conveniently located either. Sometimes suitable stone was miles away, necessitating the organization of the medieval equivalent of a cross-country moving company. They would construct temporary wooden roads specifically to handle the weight of the stone blocks. These roads were actually quite ingenious. They'd lay down thick wooden planks and replace them regularly as they wore out. A team of oxen could haul approximately 2 tons of stone at once, moving at a blistering pace of 2 when you ever around. At that speed, if the quarry was 10 miles away, an entire day would be spent just completing a single round trip. Records from one castle construction project show they needed 200 oxen working continuously for 3 years, merely to transport the stone. Some resourceful builders utilized rivers when possible. Floating stone downstream on barges was the medieval equivalent of prime shipping, faster and easier than land transport. Of course, this was only feasible if a river conveniently ran between your quarry and building site. Otherwise, it was back to the oxen express. But stone wasn't the only essential material. Wood was equally important, and they required vast quantities. It was used for scaffolding, roofs, doors, and temporary structures during construction. Records from one castle build indicate they used over 3,000 trees just for scaffolding. Imagine being responsible for counting all those trees. Medieval deforestation was so extensive that some areas of England still haven't fully recovered their woodland 800 years later. The wood situation became so critical in some areas that special laws regarding tree felling were enacted. Some kings even declared entire forests off limits to everyone except castle builders. Violating these laws could lead to severe consequences, like spending the rest of your life in the dungeon you helped to build. Quite the ironic punishment. Then there was the issue of skilled labor. Master stonemasons were like the rock stars of the medieval construction world. Kings would actually compete for the best builders, offering them special privileges and generous salaries. Some masons became so renowned they could demand outrageous perks. One master mason reportedly insisted on being partially paid in wine, specifying precisely which vineyards it had to come from. Talk about medieval workplace benefits. The actual workforce was enormous. Historical records show that some castle builds employed over 1,000 workers at peak construction. There were specialized stonecutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, and general laborers. Each group had its own guild regulations, pay scales, and working conditions. Managing all these workers was like herding cats if cats wore medieval work boots and argued about lunch breaks. Speaking of workers, let's acknowledge the unsung heroes of castle construction, the rope makers. These individuals literally held everything together. A major castle build could consume several miles of rope for hauling stones and operating pulleys. The rope had to be incredibly strong and regularly replaced. One castle's accounts revealed they used enough rope in a year to stretch from London to Paris. The most surprising material they utilized was iron. They needed tons of it for tools, nails, hinges, and other metalwork. A large castle might require up to 50 tons of iron, and this was at a time when iron was worth its weight in silver. Records from one castle show they used over 50,000 nails just for scaffolding. Imagine being the medieval intern tasked with counting those. Quality control was another major concern. Stone blocks had to be cut to precise specifications. Workers developed sophisticated techniques for assessing stone quality. Some would even lick the stones to check for impurities. Not the most hygienic method, but hey, whatever works. They also had to inspect wood for rotten iron for impurities. A single substandard material could cause an entire wall to collapse. Finally, there was the storage challenge. Medieval builders had to keep their materials organized and protected from the elements. They constructed temporary shelters for storing tools and materials, which sometimes ended up being almost as large as the castle itself. It was like having a medieval Home Depot right on the construction site. With all these materials finally assembled, and likely a few added gray hairs on the king's head, it was time for the next phase, laying the foundation. Because when you're about to stack thousands of tons of stone into walls and towers, ensuring they rest on something solid is crucial. Some castle foundations went so deep they reached bedrock, but that's a story for another part of our castle building adventure. With thousands of tons of stone ready to go, thanks to all those oxen we discussed earlier, they couldn't simply start stacking rocks and hope for the best. That would be akin to attempting to build a card tower on a wobbly table. Amusing for about 10 seconds, then disastrous. The initial step was digging, lots and lots of digging. Medieval builders would excavate until they reached solid bedrock, which sometimes meant going down 40 feet or more, deeper than a 3-story house is tall. Recent archaeological examinations of castle ruins have shown that some foundations extended even deeper. One castle in Wales had foundations reaching 65 feet below ground. The builders must have felt like they were digging to China. The foundation trenches weren't just filled with ordinary stone either. They utilized a medieval version of concrete called mortar, a mixture of lime, sand, and water. However, sometimes they innovated with the recipe. Some builders added animal blood to their mortar mix, believing it enhanced its strength. Others incorporated egg whites, hair, and even beer. One might say medieval castles were held together by history's most peculiar smoothie. This is where medieval engineering becomes truly ingenious. These builders created what we now term step foundations. These resembled colossal underground pyramids turned upside down, widening as they descended. This distributed the castle's weight and enhanced stability. One particularly impressive example unearthed in Scotland had 7 distinct steps. Speaking of unusual construction techniques, archaeologists have discovered some strange items in castle foundations. One castle in England had chicken bones deliberately placed in its foundation. Medieval lucky chicken bones. They've also found coins, religious artifacts, and even shoes. At a castle in France, they found a complete cat skeleton, though historians believe this was more of an accident than a ritual. The actual process of laying the foundation was incredibly meticulous. Workers used wooden frames and plumb lines to ensure everything was perfectly vertical. If alignment was compromised at the foundation level, the entire castle would resemble a failed game of Jenga. Archaeological evidence reveals that some foundations were so precisely laid, they are only off by a few inches over hundreds of feet. Quite remarkable for individuals working with basic tools. The size of these foundations was astounding. A typical castle foundation could be up to 30 feet thick, wider than some modern houses, and they weren't just solid blocks. Builders would create a rubble core by filling the middle with smaller stones and debris, then encasing it with carefully cut stones on the exterior. This technique conserved materials and actually fortified the foundation. Recent studies have demonstrated that this rubble core technique was so effective it aided some castles in surviving earthquakes that devastated nearby structures. Temperature was a critical factor when laying foundations. If it was excessively hot, the mortar would dry too rapidly and crack. Too cold, and it wouldn't set properly at all. Medieval records document builders employing inventive solutions to this challenge. They would work at night during summer heat waves and cover fresh mortar with straw in winter to protect it from frost. Some particularly dedicated builders even set up shifts to fan the mortar as it dried. Medieval air conditioning. One foundation technique they employed was called continuous pour. They would work around the clock in shifts to ensure the foundation was laid in one continuous piece. This necessitated organizing hundreds of workers in rotating teams, akin to a medieval construction relay race. Historical records from one castle build describe workers passing stones hand to hand in human chains stretching hundreds of feet. They even utilized special whistles and drums to coordinate the workers. A medieval version of a construction site radio. The most remarkable aspect is that many of these foundations are still performing their function today, centuries later. While the castles above them might be in ruins, their foundations are often still perfectly solid. Modern engineers have examined them and discovered that certain medieval foundation methods were so effective that we still employ similar techniques today. One castle foundation in Germany was so expertly constructed that modern builders opted to erect a new building directly on top of it. Talk about recycling. However, it wasn't all serious business. Medieval records include some rather amusing foundation-related occurrences. One chronicle recounts a builder who inadvertently embedded his cherished lucky hammer in the foundation mix and spent 3 days attempting to excavate it before his supervisor noticed. Another tale tells of a worker who fell asleep inside a foundation trench and had to be extracted the following morning. Workplace safety standards were, shall we say, somewhat different back then. With all that subterranean work concluded and hopefully everyone's lucky charms appropriately positioned, it was time to commence wall construction. Because a foundation, regardless of its impressiveness, is merely a fancy hole in the ground until you add something on top. And medieval castle walls were no ordinary walls. They were engineering masterpieces designed to endure for centuries and halt armies in their tracks. Constructing walls capable of withstanding the test of time and warfare demanded considerable medieval ingenuity. Medieval castle walls, built upon those massive foundations we just discussed, were not your typical garden walls. These walls had to endure everything from battering rams to trebuchet assaults. The actual construction process resembled a medieval version of a layer cake, albeit far less palatable. Each layer served a specific purpose. The outer faces utilized meticulously cut stones that interlocked like puzzle pieces. These weren't purely for aesthetics. Precisely cut stones enhanced the wall's strength and made it more difficult to climb. Recent archaeological studies have demonstrated that some master masons could cut stones so precisely that even today you cannot insert a credit card between them. Behind these refined stones came a layer of rougher rocks, and in the center, things became interesting. The wall's core was filled with a mixture termed rubble fill, a medieval builder's secret ingredient. They would dump in smaller stones, leftover fragments from cutting the large blocks, and combine it all with mortar. Records from one castle indicate they even threw in old tools, broken pottery, and on one occasion, someone's accidental lunch. Archaeologists are particularly fond of finding these middle sections because they are like time capsules of medieval construction sites. Hoisting those massive stones to such heights required some ingenious engineering. They employed wooden cranes called windlasses, essentially giant medieval elevators powered by individuals walking inside enormous wheels like hamsters in a cage. Historical accounts mention one particularly unfortunate worker who spent so much time in the wheel that his friends began calling him Sir Hamster. These windlasses could lift stones weighing up to 2 tons, the weight of a modern car. The walls weren't just straight vertical structures either. Most castle walls were built with a slight inward slope, wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. This was not due to medieval builders' poor eyesight. The slope strengthened the wall and aided in deflecting projectiles. One castle wall in Scotland had such a perfect slope that modern engineers still study it today. Builders would sometimes incorporate secret passages within the walls. These weren't solely for dramatic escapes. They were used to move supplies, transmit messages, and even eavesdrop on castle guests. One castle in France had so many secret passages that a guard once became lost in them for 2 days. Modern surveys have revealed that some castles had up to a mile of hidden passages winding through their walls. The stones themselves tell fascinating stories. Many castle walls still bear masons' marks, personal signatures carved by the workers who constructed them. These weren't merely ancient graffiti. Masons used these marks to verify which stones they had laid, ensuring they received payment. Archaeologists have cataloged over 1,200 distinct masons' marks from a single castle, each unique. Some masons were quite creative with their marks. One mason in Wales consistently carved tiny dragons, while another was known for his detailed cats. Temperature fluctuations posed a constant challenge for wall builders. Stone expands in heat and contracts in cold, which could cause the mortar to crack. Their solution was to build in the stages, but only during the early morning and late evening. Medieval records show precise work schedules. Work commenced 1 hour after sunrise, ceased at mid-morning, resumed in the late afternoon, and continued until sunset. During one particularly hot summer, a castle in Spain recorded workers only laying stones between midnight and dawn. The most impressive technical feat was the corners. Cornerstones had to be cut with exceptional precision because they held everything together. These stones were so valuable that some medieval kings had them carved from special stone quarried hundreds of miles away. Archaeological analysis has revealed that some cornerstones weighed up to 3 tons and had to be shaped with accuracy down to a fraction of an inch, all done manually with basic tools. Speaking of maintenance, they built scaffolding as they progressed upwards, but this wasn't your modern metal scaffolding. They used wooden poles inserted through holes in the walls called putlog holes. These holes are still visible in many castles today. One castle in Germany has over 3,000 putlog holes. The medieval builders actually left them there intentionally for future repairs. They even wrote detailed instructions about which holes to use for different repair tasks. Medieval maintenance manuals. The walls also incorporated some clever defensive features. They built arrow loops, narrow slits through which archers could shoot while remaining protected. But here's the ingenious aspect. These slits were wider on the inside than the outside. This meant defenders could shoot at various angles while presenting a tiny target to attackers. Tests with modern replicas have shown that a medieval archer could cover about 70 degrees of arc through a single arrow loop. With the walls reaching skyward, it was time to consider the castle's true showstoppers, the towers and gatehouse. Because what is more intimidating than a massive stone wall? A massive stone wall with towers that can rain arrows down upon your head. But that is a whole other chapter of medieval engineering genius. The real stars of medieval castle defense were the towers and gatehouse, essentially the medieval equivalent of a high-tech security system, minus the electricity, computers, and everything else that makes modern security actually high-tech. Towers weren't just for show or for princesses to let down their hair. They were serious business. Round towers became the most popular design, and for good reason. Tests on surviving castle ruins have shown that round towers were 50% more likely to withstand bombardment than square ones. Plus, there were no corners for attackers to conceal themselves. At one French castle, archaeologists found evidence of an attack where the square tower sustained heavy damage, while its round neighbor remained practically unscathed. Tower walls were often even thicker than regular castle walls, sometimes reaching up to 20 feet thick. Archaeologists at one Welsh castle discovered that its main tower walls contained over 3,000 tons of stone, enough to build 30 modern houses. The builders had to be creative with the construction process for these massive towers. They actually built them in stages, allowing each level to settle before adding the next. One tower took 3 years just to settle properly before they could finish it. They built into towers spiral staircases, which always turned clockwise going upwards. This wasn't because medieval builders were obsessed with consistency. It was actually a clever defensive feature. Most people are right-handed, so attackers ascending the stairs would have their sword hand against the center wall, giving them less room to swing. Meanwhile, defenders descending could swing freely with their right hand. Records from one castle recount an instance where 20 attackers were held off by just 3 defenders, thanks to this staircase design. Speaking of stairs, they weren't all uniform. Some steps were deliberately constructed at different heights, medieval trip hazards. Defenders knew precisely where these uneven steps were, but attackers would stumble and fall. One castle even had a step nicknamed the Breaker because it was 2 inches higher than all the others. Archaeological studies have found that some of these trap steps were so effective they showed more wear from people falling than from regular use. Now let's discuss the castle's front door, the gatehouse. This wasn't your average welcome center. The gatehouse had more defensive features than a modern bank vault. First, you had the drawbridge, not just for show. Modern reconstructions have demonstrated that a typical drawbridge could be raised in under 30 seconds. Then came the portcullis, a heavy metal grate that dropped down like a medieval security shutter. Most gatehouses had 2 portcullises with a space between them called the killing ground. Records from one castle showed that defenders could trap attackers in this space, and well, let's just say it wasn't called the killing ground for nothing. Some particularly elaborate gatehouses even had false entrances, medieval dummy doors, designed to trick attackers into wasting time on the wrong target. One castle in England had 3 identical-looking gatehouses, but only one was real. The other 2 led to dead ends, filled with those nasty defensive surprises we mentioned earlier. Talk about medieval misdirection. The nasty surprises came from above, murder holes. These holes in the ceiling allowed defenders to drop all sorts of unpleasant things on attackers. Historical documents list some creative ammunition: rocks, arrows, hot sand, boiling water, beehives, lime powder, and even kitchen waste. One castle's records mention a particularly successful defense where they dropped a beehive on attackers, creating instant chaos. Medieval pest control and castle defense. Two birds with one stone. The towers also housed the castle's early warning system, lookouts. These individuals had the highest office in the medieval world, sometimes over 100 feet up. They used a complex system of horns and bells to signal different types of threats. One castle had 12 different horn signals, including specific ones for enemy approaching. Someone's trying to steal the sheep again, and the tax collector is coming. Tests on reconstructed tower heights have shown that lookouts could spot approaching armies from up to 5 miles away in good weather. That's about an hour's warning before attackers reach the castle. Plenty of time to raise the drawbridge and heat up some defensive boiling water. Some towers even had specially designed acoustic features that could amplify the sound of approaching horses, providing even earlier warnings. With all these defenses in place, you might think castles would be impossible to capture. But medieval engineers knew that no defense was perfect, which is why they always included one final fallback position: the keep. This was the castle's ultimate panic room, a fortress within a fortress, where defenders could hold out even if everything else fell. Unlike modern panic rooms, though, this one was the size of a small apartment building and designed to support hundreds of people for months at a time. If everything else failed and enemies breached the walls, towers, and that nasty gatehouse we just discussed, the keep was where everyone would retreat to hide. It was like a giant medieval panic room, except instead of lasting a few hours, people could survive in there for months. The keep's walls made regular castle walls look like paper. We're talking about walls up to 40 feet thick at the base. Archaeological studies have shown that some keeps could survive hits from trebuchets, throwing rocks weighing as much as a small car. One famous keep took 163 direct hits during a siege and barely got scratched. Modern engineers have calculated that some keep walls could withstand forces equivalent to a modern tank shell. Talk about over-engineering. The entrance to the keep was usually on the second floor, not the ground level. You had to climb up a wooden staircase to get in, and this staircase could be pulled up or burned if enemies got too close. Records from one siege tell of attackers who finally broke into the castle only to find themselves staring up at the keep's entrance 20 feet above their heads. Archaeological evidence shows that some keeps even had elaborate systems of counterweights to raise these stairs in under 30 seconds. The inside of the keep wasn't exactly a 5-star hotel. Windows were tiny, more like arrow slits with attitude. Tests on reconstructed keeps have shown that these windows let in about as much light as a cheap flashlight. Kings would actually have servants follow them around with candles during the day. One medieval writer complained that keeps were as dark as a tax collector's heart. Recent studies of medieval documents show that some keeps went through over 1,000 candles per month just for basic lighting. Storage was crucial in keeps. They had to be prepared for long sieges, which meant storing tons of food and supplies. Archaeologists found one keep with storage rooms that could hold enough food for 400 people to survive for 6 months. They kept grain in special pits that were carefully designed to keep out rats and moisture. Some of these storage systems were so effective that archaeologists have found preserved grain in castle rooms that's over 500 years old. The keep's plumbing system was interesting. Most keeps had a garderobe. Fancy medieval talk for a toilet. These were basically holes in the wall that dropped everything straight down the outside of the keep. Some castles had up to 30 garderobes stacked on top of each other. Analysis of castle records shows that they actually employed special workers, called gong farmers, to clean up the mess at the bottom. One castle even paid these workers partly in alcohol, probably necessary for that kind of job. Each floor of the keep had a specific purpose. The ground floor was usually for storage. The second floor held the Great Hall, where the king would meet people and pretend everything smelled fine. Above that were private rooms for the royal family. Recent architectural investigations have demonstrated that medieval builders employed ingenious ventilation systems in an attempt to prevent odors from circulating between different levels. While these systems weren't always entirely effective, Their effort is commendable. Intriguingly, medieval wells often penetrated the earth to depths exceeding those of modern building foundations. The well at Dover Castle, for instance, plunges 400 feet, surpassing the height of the Statue of Liberty. The construction encountered so many difficulties that the king famously wrote a letter stating that if water wasn't found soon, they might as well be constructing an exceptionally expensive stone tomb. Modern geologists analyzing these wells have concluded that medieval builders possessed an uncanny ability to pinpoint water sources for digging, despite lacking any modern surveying tools. The design of the keep also incorporated clandestine features. Many included concealed escape tunnels known as sally ports. These tunnels enabled defenders to discreetly exit during a siege to launch attacks against the besiegers. Archaeological surveys have unearthed that some keeps had extensive networks of these tunnels, occasionally stretching for hundreds of yards. One particularly cunning design even featured decoy tunnels that were designed to flood if discovered by enemies. Security measures extended beyond merely thick walls. Keeps frequently featured sophisticated internal defense systems. Each floor could be isolated from the others, and certain keeps even had internal drawbridges between different sections. Castle records indicate that guards were required to memorize a complex series of passwords and secret knocks, a medieval form of two-factor authentication. Documents from one castle list 24 distinct secret knocks, each carrying a different meaning. Living arrangements within the keeps were also quite inventive due to limited space. Rooms often served multiple purposes. The Great Hall would function as a dining room during the day and transform into a sleeping quarters for guards at night. Furniture was designed for easy mobility or disassembly. With all of these defensive features, provisions, and secret tunnels in place, the castle was nearing readiness for action. However, a castle is of limited use without people to defend and maintain it. The subsequent challenge was determining how to render this colossal stone fortress actually habitable. The crucial question medieval builders had to address after completing those massive walls, towers, and keeps was, what transforms a gigantic pile of rocks into a home? Residing in a castle was not akin to moving into a contemporary house. You couldn't simply contact the utility company and activate the heating. Warming a castle was comparable to trying to heat a cave, except this cave had windows that didn't close properly. Fireplaces were the solution, and medieval builders constructed them on a grand scale. Truly grand. Archaeological investigations have uncovered castle fireplaces capable of accommodating entire tree trunks. One castle in Scotland had fireplaces so immense that a team of servants would haul in 16-foot logs every morning. The king's annual firewood expenditure surpassed the yearly salaries of some servants. Tests conducted on reconstructed medieval fireplaces demonstrated they could consume an entire tree in just 2 days during cold weather. Some builders even developed an early form of central heating, constructing hollow channels within the walls where hot air from the fireplaces could ascend throughout the castle. Recent studies of castle ruins have identified these heating ducts in several high-status rooms. Analysis suggests these systems could elevate room temperatures by approximately 10 degrees. Not exactly tropical, but certainly preferable to freezing. One medieval author lauded a castle as being as warm as a baker's oven. Although given typical medieval castle temperatures, that baker was probably facing dismissal. Water systems presented another significant challenge. While wells were available, transporting water to the upper floors was incredibly laborious. Records indicate that some castles employed water boys, whose sole task was to carry buckets up and down stairs all day. Accounts from one castle detail a payment to a water boy for new shoes every month, suggesting those stairs were particularly hard on medieval footwear. Estimates suggest a typical castle required about 500 gallons of water daily for basic operations. A considerable number of trips up and down those spiral staircases. Rainwater harvesting was a prevalent solution. Medieval builders devised elaborate systems of gutters and pipes to collect rainwater and store it in vast tanks. Analysis of one castle's water system revealed it could collect enough rainwater in a single substantial storm to supply the castle for a week. The tanks were so well designed that some continue to hold water even today. Although you would likely not want to drink from 800-year-old rainwater, it's not exactly refreshing. Lighting posed another interesting challenge. Without electricity, castle inhabitants relied on a combination of natural light filtering through those diminutive windows we discussed earlier. and artificial light from candles and oil lamps. Castle records document staggering quantities of candles being used. One castle consumed 8,000 candles in a single month, roughly 260 candles per day. And these weren't inexpensive dollar store candles. They were high-quality beeswax candles that were very costly. The position of chandler, the person responsible for candles, was actually quite significant. You definitely didn't want to be the individual who allowed the castle to run out of candles. Glass windows were a luxury that would make a modern billionaire envious. Early medieval castles simply had wooden shutters, forcing a choice between freezing or sitting in darkness. When glass windows did become available, they were so precious that some nobles would take them along when traveling between castles. Historical records mention castle bathrooms deserve special attention. Besides garderobes, castles needed provisions for personal hygiene. Bath time was a major undertaking. Servants had to heat numerous buckets of water and carry them up several flights of stairs. Records from one castle include a complaint from servants about having to carry 40 buckets of hot water for the ladies' bath, followed by a note indicating she found it not warm enough. Archaeological evidence hints that some castles had rudimentary shower systems, essentially buckets with holes that servants would fill with hot water. Medieval spa days were arduous for everyone involved. Storage was practically a science in itself. Without refrigeration, preserving food freshness demanded meticulous planning. Castles had dedicated cold rooms built into their north-facing walls where temperature studies have shown they could maintain temperatures approximately 10 degrees cooler than the outside. They also had separate storage rooms for different food types. One room solely for cheese, another for meat, another for grain. An inventory from one castle lists 23 distinct storage rooms, each with its own specific purpose. Modern analysis of these storage systems reveals they were surprisingly effective. Some could keep grain fresh for over a year. The kitchen was essentially a room designed to be constantly on fire. They were typically constructed with stone vaults and massive chimneys to manage the heat and smoke from cooking, which occurred literally all day long. Archaeological evidence indicates that some castle kitchens had floors replaced every few years because the persistent heat would crack the stones. Temperature reconstructions suggest these kitchens regularly reached over 120 degrees Celsius. One kitchen was nicknamed the Dragon's Den because it was so intensely hot that new servants would often faint on their first day. With all these systems implemented to make the castle somewhat habitable, only one crucial element remained: people to defend it. Because a castle devoid of soldiers was merely a very expensive stone house, vulnerable to being captured. But medieval military life presented its own unique set of challenges. A castle's effectiveness is solely determined by the individuals defending it. You could possess the thickest walls, the tallest towers, and the most elaborate murder holes in all of Europe. But without trained soldiers to operate them, your castle might as well be constructed of sand. Medieval military life was far from easy. These individuals had to be prepared for any eventuality, ranging from minor raids to full-scale sieges. Let's consider some numbers. A medium-sized castle typically required around 100 soldiers for basic defense. During wartime, this number could surge to over 500. Archaeological evidence from one castle showed that soldiers' quarters were so confined that each man had about as much personal space as a modern coat closet. Records document one castle commander writing to the king, "The men are packed in like pickled herrings and smell about as fresh." Analysis of castle ruins suggests some soldiers slept in shifts because there wasn't sufficient space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Training was continuous. Archers practiced daily. Medieval law actually mandated that all men practice archery on Sundays. Tests conducted with recovered medieval longbows reveal they required up to 150 lips of force to draw, equivalent to attempting to lift a grown adult each time you shoot an arrow. Skeletal remains of medieval archers show they developed asymmetrical bones from years of practice. Their right arms were frequently 50% larger than their left. Records mention an archer who could hit a target the size of a dinner plate from 200 yards away. These same records also note he was utterly unbearable to be around because he wouldn't cease boasting about it. Castle defenders had quite inventive weapons at their disposal. Besides the conventional arrows and spears, they employed items like caltrops, nasty little spikes designed to always point upwards, regardless of how they landed. Archaeological digs have unearthed thousands of these around castle sites. One castle siege concluded when attackers were forced to retreat because their horses kept stepping on caltrops. The defenders had scattered so many that it took 3 months to clear them all afterwards. Food during a siege presented another major challenge. Calculations based on medieval records indicate that feeding 500 defenders required approximately 900 lbs of food per day. Studies of castle storage rooms showed they could hold enough preserved food to sustain the entire garrison for up to 6 months. One castle endured a year-long siege by rationing food so strictly that even the lord had to consume the same portions as common soldiers. Castle records list increasingly imaginative recipes as the siege progressed, including leather boot soup and boiled tapestry. Medieval times were indeed harsh. Castle defenders had specialized roles that sound rather peculiar today. The habitable was a soldier who rode a small horse around the castle walls, inspecting for weaknesses. The spring-awned master maintained giant crossbow-like machines that could launch spears the size of small trees. Sleep was a luxury during wartime. Guards worked in 4-hour shifts, and records indicate they had some creative methods to stay awake. One castle provided its night watchmen with special spiced wine, believed to keep them alert. Analysis of preserved wine jars suggests this guard wine was infused with herbs like rosemary and sage, medieval energy drinks. Another tactic was to make guards carry heavy rocks while on patrol. Being caught sleeping on duty was a serious offense. One castle's regulations stipulated that sleeping guards would have to spend the following day wearing their chainmail inside out. Extremely uncomfortable and humiliating. The most impressive aspect of castle defense was the coordination required. Different groups had to function together like a medieval special forces team. Castle records include detailed defensive manuals, one of which was 50 pages long and included 20 different trumpet signals for various commands. Archaeological evidence shows they even had backup communication systems utilizing colored flags and mirror signals for situations when trumpets were inaudible due to noise. A successful siege typically lasted between 6 to 8 months. The longest recorded siege of a medieval castle endured for 21 years. Studies of letters from this siege reveal that by the end, the attackers and defenders had become so accustomed to each other that they would occasionally pause fighting to exchange jokes and insults. Some even exchanged Christmas presents, though likely not very generous ones. Ultimately, all these defenses proved quite effective until someone invented gunpowder. Tests on castle walls demonstrated that early cannon fire could inflict more damage in a single hour than a traditional siege engine could in a week. Suddenly, those thick stone walls weren't quite as impressive anymore. But that's a completely different narrative about how medieval warfare had to fundamentally change when castles ceased to be invincible.